I think a lot of training, a lot of reading, a lot of study, it's preparation, but it doesn't become ours until it's experiential. When Abraham lifted the knife and existentially was in that crisis of trust, God says, now I know that you trust me. And I thought, what an awful test of faith. But that existential crisis in my life of relinquishing my wife, I realized that's when I knew that same faith. Not the preparation, not just imagining, well, gee, what if she dies? But in her actual dying.
All right, so I just got done editing this conversation I had with my good friend Dave Beach, and I just had to go out for a walk to kind of process things. He is a deep and wise man. He's been a friend for 10 years, and he has been through the gauntlet. He's an academic. He's extremely intelligent, and what you'll find is that he can really speak from that cerebral place very easily, but his heart is so much bigger and his wisdom is so much deeper than that cerebral intelligence. And you'll run into all three in this kind of a long form conversation we have around suffering, and that's been a passion topic for him since he lost his wife to cancer. And we talk about that, amongst other things. And he has kept the faith. He's stayed identified as a Christian, but he has deconstructed really well. So that's the best introduction I can give. So I walked to the post office here to process everything. But I hope you enjoy it. I certainly enjoyed my conversation. So here is Dr. Dave Beach. Well, welcome, Dr. Dave Beach. Dear friend of mine, welcome to the podcast. Now, you got some creds that take up a lot of space on my document here because you've just done a lot of stuff. You're currently the executive director of 4Health Family Resource Center Incorporated here in Saranac, Michigan. I'm on site with you today. You're a retired licensed counselor and college professor. You're a current chaplain. You've authored the book, The Essential Bible Companion to the Psalms. You've been a contributing author to Hope in the Morning Bible, but morning as in like MOURNING. You're a speaker, you're a spiritual formation workshop facilitator, and also, most importantly to me, you've been a dear friend of mine for 10 years about.
Yeah.
So welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. You came out to my office a little while back and we had a good conversation, and I thought, next time we do this, we got to have microphones because our conversations are just always so deep and rich, and I wish I could share them. And now we get to do that.
Oh,
and I'm excited for that.
good.
Now, we met through a mutual friend, Pete McGowan. I don't know if you remember this, but shout out to Third Wave Coffee and Building.
Yeah, Pete.
He gave me your phone number and he's like, you need to talk to this guy. And I was like, okay. So I called, we sat down and talked for like over an hour, I think, about our spiritual journeys and spiritual formation and just issues in the church. And we seemed to just have like a real like similar pathway in many ways. So that's been, and we've been friends for like 10 years now. So
yeah. And if I recall, when we met, you were in the program at George Fox Evangelical Seminary, now Portland Seminary.
Yes.
Or you were just about to enter the program.
Yes.
I forget.
I think I was at the beginning stages of it.
Okay.
Because I graduated with my doctorate from there in 2015. My dissertation was all approved. So that was a 3-year journey before then. So 2012 to 2015.
Yeah.
And that's right when we met, is 2012.
Yeah. And then all the things you shared about George Fox made me want to go.
And then you did.
And then I did, and it just was the perfect program, and I'm so glad that through you, I was able to find just the right program and was finally able to write a dissertation about suffering, human suffering and spiritual formation.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that because I think you really add to the conversation in a very helpful way. Before we get there, fun fact, George Fox University sent me a windbreaker because you signed up for the program and mentioned me. So I got a jacket.
Yay!
Because you mentioned me. So thank you for my jacket.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that must have been Cliff Berger.
I think it was, yeah. I think it was.
Cliff. That's good to know.
Yeah. So if you ever reference somebody to George Fox, they'll send you a jacket. And I still have mine after all these years.
Huh.
Well, Dave, you've kind of grown up within the church system here in America. How would you describe your spiritual roots, like the soil that you grew out of?
Well, I was the third child of a Baptist minister and his wife, and they met in Bible school. And my dad continued on to seminary, started a family, and he started preaching in West Michigan in the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. That was
the GARB.
The GARB, right. So that might help if you know anything about the Baptist traditions. And actually the BAPTIST stands for, in an acronym, stands for their beliefs.
Oh, really? They constructed an entire doctrinal statement around the word Baptist?
Pretty much. It's kind of like TULIP,
Yeah, I did not know that, actually.
Oh, yeah. Well,
you don't have to recall it, but there's just so much. We could go down so many roads with that one about how that makes problems, but
yeah. Well, I think there's certain flavors of fundamentalism that some are a little more militant than others. My dad was a country boy, came to faith in Christ at 19 years of age, and I come into his life when he's 27, so he's on a fairly new faith journey and hadn't really been through a whole lot in terms of suffering, human suffering. And so I would say that both my mom and dad, coming to faith in their teen years, were in the beginning stages of their spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
When I listened to my dad, whether it was at home or in the pulpit, it was the foundational parts of the Bible that appealed to my dad and my mom. And they were attracted to all the latest choruses and hymn books. And so that was a big part of my spiritual grounding as well. Little choruses that we learned. My mother was the one who taught us the music as little kids. And one song in particular I remember is, I'm in right out, right up, right down, right happy all the time. I'm in right out.
Yes.
Okay.
I remember that one.
Yeah.
From my Sunday school days too.
And there's others like it. And then in the hymn book, there were hymns that basically were for beginners in the spiritual journey. Trust and obey. Trust and obey.
There's no other way.
There's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. And so the implication is if you trust and you obey, you will be happy in Jesus. And then one that was also in the hymn book, that when I read it, I have to really scratch my head, is carry your cross with a smile. Carry your cross with a smile. Carry your cross with a smile. Others to Jesus you may beguile, if you carry your cross with a smile. I think, why would you want to beguile anyone to faith? But it makes sense, but I could never sing that now. I could never sing that chorus. Of course, I can't sing the other one either. I'm happy all the time.
Right.
But that is kind of a brief snapshot of my upbringing. And I don't remember any acute suffering, no life-threatening illness in my immediate family. So I led a pretty safe and sheltered life in small towns. And when I think back about what was happening in the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of JFK, and then RFK, and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and racial unrest, civil rights movement, all of the things that were occurring. And then you add on that, it's all post-World War II with the bomb and considerations. Life was really chaotic and messy when I was a kid, but I just seemed impervious to that because my parents did a good job of keeping a lot of that from me.
Yeah. You mentioned all those songs, and I think like those songs are meant to teach us things, but it almost sounds like what they end up doing is insulate us from the reality of the world, of how difficult things can become. And then there's like a moment where your insulation breaks down and you're exposed to the elements of the real world, and your faith and your church and your community has been trying to shield you from this and deny it with their preaching and their songs and their doctrinal statements, and give us like this false understanding of how things actually work and what God is like. And that gives us a story to tell about who we are and God is and the world is, that it doesn't quite like work when that insulation runs out and you hit a wall of some kind. Or like, what was the moment for you? What was your first domino where you started to say, maybe I'm not in right, upright, downright, left, right, behind, happy all the time. I can't get them all correct, but that first domino to fall and say, you know what, this doesn't seem to be working. It doesn't seem to quite hold up to reality.
Yeah, I think the first one happened when I was 16, and this is some years back. So there may have been minor ones before, but the first significant one happened because of issues of power and congregations being a little less than compassionate to a pastor and his family.
You being the pastor's kid probably had front row seats to this.
I did. In fact, it happened at the very first annual church business meeting that I was allowed to go to, which was kind of like a rite of passage. Because in those small churches, that was the rite of passage. You got your driver's license and you could go to the annual church business meeting.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah, it actually was, to me anyway.
Yeah.
Because I knew all these people. This was my community. And we were close like family. Family meant a lot to me. But in this first meeting, what I didn't realize was that because there was this thing called a confidence vote every 3 years, and this would have been the 6th year now that my dad had been there, and it meant that my dad either was continuing as pastor or was fired. I had no idea. So I go into the meeting and listen to the different people talk about so-and-so is running for deacon, they have an election, they talk about the budget, and then at the very end, my dad, who's the moderator, leaves the sanctuary with my mother, and the chairman of the board now takes up the podium, and he begins a dialogue, begins a church discussion about this confidence vote, and people are allowed to talk. And I start noticing that people are there that I hadn't seen in months. Some hadn't been there for a year or two, but they were still on the rolls, and they were still part of the quorum.
Mm-hmm.
So there had been this clipboard brigade and this orchestrated effort to vote against my dad. So these people start standing up and saying all these petty grievances about my dad, and I had no idea that they felt those things or thought like that. And by the slimmest of margins, I think like one vote, they got the necessary 1/3 to vote my dad out.
Oh my gosh.
Dad had to win the vote by 2/3 or more in order to stay. And I was mad. And for the first time, I was really mad at people that I loved. And I had no vehicle. There was no process, at least none that I knew of telling them that I just wanted to tackle them to the ground and, challenge them.
Yeah.
So I walked around the block of a little farming community where the church was. I just walked around the block, fuming mad. That was the first domino, I think.
Wow. So where did you go after that? Did he get another pastorate position, or?
Well, it was kind of an odd thing. The meeting had been scheduled on the wrong Wednesday, because it was supposed to be the first Wednesday after the first Sunday of September, but there hadn't been a Sunday yet. So they actually had it on the first Wednesday, but it should have been on the second Wednesday. So they had to reschedule the meeting. And that meeting was rancorous because a lot of people didn't show because they thought, Pastor Beach, there's no problem. I don't need to go. Well, they showed up and, people were threatening lawsuits, and it just really got ugly. And I don't think I was prepared to see that. I thought these were nice, good Christian people. And it wasn't necessarily my faith that was challenged at that time. It was just, who are these people that I've been hanging out with? And what are they really like? And do I even like him? I wasn't sure anymore.
Wow, that sounds really familiar to the stories of a lot of younger people today that grew up in the church, and then they've seen how the last few elections have gone, and they'll look and say, if that's what this community is like, then I don't belong here.
Yeah.
And so this is back even further,
Yeah.
So there's been something brewing in the community, just in the ground, in the soil, and now it's starting to take, like, you're seeing the actual fruits of it drop. What's really interesting is when you look at, there's like a relationship between a pastor and a congregation. The pastor is supposed to be spiritually forming the people. He's seen as a shepherd, and that can go south in two ways. One, the pastor can abuse the power, and we've seen plenty of stories of that.
Yeah.
And then what is not necessarily seen are stories like your dad, where you can spiritually form us to a point, and then we'll vote you out.
Yeah.
And so there's so many pastors that I've talked to who say, I really am uncomfortable with the politics of my church and how who they're supporting and what they're supporting. But I can't say anything because they'll fire me. Or even doctrinally, they'll say, I'm uncomfortable with certain doctrines now, but I can't say anything or they'll fire me.
Yeah.
And so there's almost like this dual polarity that's happening where the pastor can have too much power and abuse it. We've seen from these Hillsong documentaries and all these different news articles, the Julie Roys report, those things we need to hold them accountable. And then there's on the opposite end of things where a pastor, his hands or her hands are tied when it comes to shaping the value systems of how a community expresses itself in like a political and social sphere. Yes. Don't talk about these subjects. Don't teach around these things. Just stick with the good, tried and true things, or else. And make sure you have my favorite song in there.
Yeah.
There's like a dynamic there that's just really interesting.
Yeah. Well, back then when this business meeting happened, it was 1972, which is the Richard Nixon era. So you've got this polarization of the country in terms of the national political leadership and the deterioration of presidential power and confidence in the leader. So there's a bit of deterioration on many levels of confidence in the leader. But, to get back to your question, what happened on the Wednesday night that the meeting was supposed to be on, they took another vote, and Dad was, he was in overwhelmingly. But to hear him tell it, he's dead now. But when he told the story, it's like it just took the heart right out of him.
Yeah.
And he wound up leaving ministry. He stayed one more year, and he stayed long enough to get that confidence vote out of the bylaws so the next guy coming in would never have to face that kind of pressure. And then very shortly after they voted that out of the bylaws, he resigned and didn't take another pastorate after that.
Man. So you're very familiar with the topic of things not being happy all the time. And there's your roots as there. And, fast forward to, today's modern day, you wrote a dissertation that was really powerful. And it is one of the most downloaded from George Fox, Portland Seminary's website. I just visited it today. You're over 6,000 downloads on it. And that's because the topic was following the man of sorrows. And I opened up that dissertation today, and I'm reading through it.
Oh.
And your dedication was beautiful. You mind if I read your dedication? It was...
Go ahead.
Okay, you said this. This is dedicated to the walking wounded, comrades of the valley who think they are alone and yet are not. Those in the wilderness experiences, exiles, and victims. May you all rise up like the man of sorrows as wounded healers who will comfort and care for the least of these, Christ's living body. And I thought to myself, what a welcome mat for a dissertation. Normally, people dedicate it to a loved one or a family member or a friend, and you dedicated this basically to all the readers who would say, this topic matters to me. Can you talk a little bit about what sparked these words and why you wrote them so beautifully that way?
Yeah, I think I had been reading a couple different pastors, older pastors. Vance Havner was one. And he wrote a book called Though I Walk Through the Valley. I'm pretty sure that's the title. It's in my dissertation. You'd think I'd remember it, but
it's okay.
Pretty sure it's though I walked through the valley, and it was after his wife Sarah died, and something shifted for him too. And I wrote, of course, my dissertation, and my thoughts about suffering started after my wife died. And so I felt a kinship with Vance Havner, and his comment was that Jesus is the leader of this group of comrades in the valley. And I loved that. Comrades of the Valley, I think, was the name of one of his chapters. The other guy was Gene Edwards, who writes quite a bit about suffering. And he made a comment that after years in the pastorate, he says, I never realized there were so many suffering Christian people. Or I think I'm paraphrasing to an extent, but that's the gist of it. And I thought, wow, if these two well-known pastors are just realizing this, there's probably still a horde of people out there, maybe more now, with the fracturing of churches and such. So I felt like I was writing to a specific community that would get it. They would be interested. And then the people like myself when I was young, or my parents even, when they were new in the faith and new in ministry, they probably wouldn't pick that up and read it. But I really wanted to walk with the man of sorrows, and I wanted to introduce him to other people who might find comfort as I did.
Not the one who is happy all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the same guy that walked on the water. It's a different picture on the cross. He relinquishes and allows that to happen. And then he says, his only filter question for discipleship, the only one, you have to take up your cross and deny yourself, or you can't even be my disciple, which is really profound. There's no filter question like you have to be an optimist, you have to be a happy person. You have to do all these other things. It's like, no. And some of his sharpest rebukes have to do with suffering. To Peter, he says, get behind me, Satan. Because you don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. And he's talking about suffering. And
yeah, because he just revealed, I need you now, Peter, know that I am Christ, the Son of the living God. It's that moment in Matthew where, who do you say I am? And Peter confesses that, and he says, good job. Now I got to go die. And Peter takes him aside and sharply rebukes Jesus. And that's to put it lightly in the Greek, but sharply rebukes him and says, may it never be so. That is, you can't do this.
Yeah.
And then Jesus then offers that rebuke. Get behind me, Satan. That was a harsh passage on both ends for Peter and Jesus.
Yeah. Well, then I think one of the second, or probably the second sharpest rebuke is the two on the road to Emmaus after the crucifixion has happened and the resurrection has happened.
Mm-hmm.
They don't recognize Jesus, but they say to him, are you the only one who doesn't know what has happened? And of course, that's the pivot point. And Jesus flips the script and says, you foolish and slow to believe.
The Greek there is slow of heart, which is a quote from Aristotle. That he says that Aristotle says that men are slow of heart to believe in anything which is against their interests of them collecting power. And these two men would have had a lot of vested interest in Christ being crowned king and wielding power to get submission from the outside so that everyone can then serve them. And Christ says, you're slow of heart to believe because this wasn't in your best interest, as in, you're not going to be the top of the food chain. where I'm doing something with love, by love, for love, in love. And because God is love.
The implication then is, by reading the Old Testament, we should be able to have the consciousness of the suffering Messiah and what it means to be a person of faith. And I think the nation of Israel, most of them anyway, missed it when Jesus was here. And I think a lot of people in the Christian church are still missing it when it comes to discipleship. What does it mean to be a person of faith? In the Old Testament, you have the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple as the central event, I think. And the miracle is that the nation of Israel resurrected. A remnant returned, they rebuilt Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple. That is profound in the history, well, in all of world history, but particularly for the Jews. And they still remember and commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem every year. And maybe there should be some parallel when we remember in communion, we remember and commemorate the death, the dying of Jesus, because I think in the Old Testament, you have the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and in the New Testament, you have the death and burial of the Messiah. And the transformation, the new orientation, as Brueggemann calls it, only happens because of the power of God. It's the remnant returns and rebuilds the city, and in the New Testament, Jesus rises from the dead.
Now, I want to get into, there's a lot of definition of terms that are really important for when we talk about suffering and what it is, and you do a great job in your dissertation, because we can use terms and almost define them in a way so that if you're not happy all the time, then you're not doing it right. Even within the framework that we're talking here. But you're not talking about suffering as purely in an academic sense. I mean, this is coming, you said in your dissertation about your wife, your first wife going through cancer, that several weeks after a transplant and then complications set in, my wife is lying comatose in the critical care unit. Doctors put her on a ventilator, gave her a large dose of corticosteroids, and said she's in God's hands now. And for me, the conceptual experience prepared me for the choices I would have to make regarding my wife's care. I would have to trust. As her condition deteriorated, I begged God to save Sue, to heal her, to allow us more time together. However, finally, as her body failed due to the complications, I lifted my hands in anguished prayer and released her to God, come what may. I imagined what Abraham felt when he raised the knife. I remember the ram. There was still hope, but for us, there was no ram. The next day, my wife died. Then the story became my own, a primary experience, a true test of faith. Would I trust God to care for her even in her dying? And I gotta say that when I was reading it this morning, I was getting a little teary-eyed. You're such a beautiful writer, and that's such a hard time. What did that trust look like in that moment? You said I had to trust God even in her dying. Can you kind of explain what trust looks like?
Yeah. Well, I think in that same section, I talked about a passage of Scripture, Genesis 22, that I was reading prior to heading to Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
And thinking about Abraham taking Isaac up the mountain, knowing what God had asked him to do. And so just before we left to go to Mayo Clinic on June 6th, we're at a state park in Grand Haven. And I'm reading this passage, and I just felt this peace and a sense of faith to trust God in the process. And I think what I'm trying to say in my dissertation is I thought I knew what that meant. I thought I knew that kind of faith. But what I realized was that was all preparation. And so I think a lot of training, a lot of reading, a lot of study, it's preparation. But it doesn't become ours until it's experiential. And so what I got clear about is when Abraham lifted the knife and existentially was in that crisis of trust, because just after that, God says, now I know that you trust me. And I thought, what an awful test of faith. But that existential crisis in my life of relinquishing my wife, I realized that's when I knew that same faith. Not the preparation, not just imagining, well, gee, what if she dies? But in her actual dying. I think there's a lot of people that think they're talking well about suffering, but they've never been through that kind of shattering. And when I say shattering, I mean it in a more technical term, in terms of psychology of trauma, the shattering of the assumptive world, because the assumptions in my world were that this is a moral universe, and if we trust and obey, we'll be happy in Jesus. So the implication is God is watching, and he pays attention to whether we're obedient or disobedient. So if we're obedient and we're praying in Jesus' name and praying for things that will glorify him, I was begging God for my wife's life, that things will work out, but they did not. And that, in terms of dominoes, that was the biggie.
Yeah.
That was King Domino. I'm not a good domino player, so I don't know if there is such a thing, but that was it. That was the one that really set a lot of questions in motion and just a lot of feelings collected, kind of like a lost pileup. Because I'd also lost my brother, but the impact, I didn't feel the impact near as much. My brother died in a single car crash about 10 years before my wife. And then after my brother died, all my grandparents died. So it wasn't that I hadn't experienced loss. It just that I was trying to power through, stay happy in Jesus, and be in, right out, right up, right down, right happy, in order to beguile people to the gospel, I guess. And that just doesn't work. And now the way I read the Bible is, that was never the plan. That was never how faith, particularly faith in the nation of Israel, that's not how they expressed their faith.
I'm going to assume that this trusting moment wasn't a clean cut, I'm good moment, but almost like this is a survival mechanism for me and God and belief. Because you really had two options, I think, at that moment. You could have perceived God as negligent, and how come you didn't rush in and rescue?
Yeah.
All my teaching, all the songs, all of the Sunday school material told me this is what you would do. You could have said, God is negligent, I'm done, and walked away.
Yeah.
And instead you did a moment of trust. But I'm sure that didn't just solve all your questions and resolve all the traumas. You said this is a shattering moment.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how trust affected the fact that you're also shattered and torn apart inside?
Yeah. Well, part of it, I think, is, you talked about, I forget how you framed it, but that I could have walked away. And I think I sensed that I could, but I had this haunting experience at Mayo Clinic. I was running every day. I'd try to get up and run about 3 miles every day. And on the other side of a channel, a man-made channel in Rochester, Minnesota, there was a cemetery. And on this kind of spooky, foggy day, I was looking over at the cemetery, and I'm not typically a mystic, but I have these moments, and so I'm sensitive to it. And it just felt like this mocking, nearly audible voice mocking my faith, and that I will destroy your faith. And something kicked in for me that was like, bring it, Go ahead and try. Because at that point, Sue hadn't died yet. And I was every day on my knees, and my dad, my pastor at the time, came and prayed with me. So we were still fighting for her life. But when she died, and the initial wave of shattering, I did feel like God had not heard me, that he had abandoned. And I felt that God-forsakenness, that Camus talks about. And I felt more of a kinship with people like Camus than I did with the happy-clappy preachers. In fact, I love rereading Camus in The Plague, Albert Camus, who's trying to make sense of a post-World War II chaotic world. And he just refuses to believe in a God who causes such suffering, and he doesn't have an answer. So people label him an atheist. But Thomas Merton describes Camus as writing this theology of evil. And in his writing, Merton's opinion is that he's not turning people away from God. He's just opening up this line of questioning. And it's raw and bitter and powerful. And so some part of faith and suffering and paradox, I think, is encapsulated there. So part of the struggle was holding those same feelings, God-forsakenness and abandonment, and yet standing, with my fists clenched and asking the age-old question, why? I don't get this. I don't understand it.
Like, how would you place the role of God within the context of suffering? Because we know God, the classic theodicy says that God is all-powerful and all-loving, and so how can suffering exist within a world in which God is all-powerful and all-loving at the same time? And I know that the classic theodicy probably doesn't have that makes it a problem instead of a mystery.
Yes.
But how would you approach the role of God within the context of suffering?
I think the mystery of the Incarnation is endlessly fascinating to me. How a compassionate Father God could send his Son, the expression of himself, the exact expression of himself, and then let such suffering happen to Christ. That's a profound mystery that's fascinating. And I think in a way, for me, it's the undoing of all those points that you made. I'm not sure I'll remember them all, but the Calvinist, for instance, and I have to be careful because I'm currently a member of a Calvinist church, and I love a lot of the tradition, but I've got to part company on certain things. And it's not this God is sovereign, so buck it up, because on the cross, Christ himself cries out in protest, the language of intense protest, my God, and he says my because he's naming himself as a covenant partner. He said, you are my God. And so implied with that is there are covenantal expectations here. I'm the human and you're God, and there are certain things I'm expected to do, and then there's also things that you're expected to do. And he's not doing them. Why have you abandoned me or forsaken me? And that is one of the most powerful statements of Jesus in the Passion that I believe is the undoing of that posture. Because that's not the posture of Jesus. It's not the mind of Christ in that crisis. He doesn't say, oh God, you're sovereign, so I'm just going to buck it up and, suck it up, buttercup, that sort of thing. That's not what Jesus does. And then I think when he tells us that in order to be his disciple, we have to take up our cross, then it's that kind of spirituality that we're expected to have. And it's a Jewish spirituality. It's very different kind of dialogue. And then the fundamentalist, the militant fundamentalist, just sitting in good Augustinian theology that I'm a sinner, so I deserve all this. It's like, well, if you believe in the sinlessness of Jesus, well then, there again, the mystery of the Incarnation. Here's a sinless man, and this is happening because of the plan of God. And so that theme of the suffering of the innocent, I think it shows up most powerfully in the book of Job, the Old Testament, Christ-like example as a man, and then Naomi as a woman. They're innocent. It's like there's no sin that is imputed to them, and this is why Naomi says, call me Mara, my life is bitter.
I never thought of Naomi as a Job figure. That just kind of made my brain explode a little.
Okay.
But yeah, wow.
Yeah, I think coming back into the community and
wow,
that's another dissertation.
Yeah, I think so. You got a couple in you. Sounds like. But you said the aim of this paper seems to be to find the intersection of suffering and one's own formation of faith. And there's so many mysteries and unanswerable questions around why it exists in the world. And I think what you do beautifully in your dissertation is getting into, like, suffering exists. It happens to everyone. No one gets out of this world without some suffering. Here's what it can do within us. And you quoted this this Catholic priest, Ignacio Martin Barro. I'd never heard of this person. There are truths that can be discovered only through suffering or from the critical vantage point of extreme situations. And then you go on to say, if Ignacio is correct that we can only know certain things through suffering, then perhaps it is easier to understand the confusion of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, whom Jesus called foolish and slow to believe because they did not understand the role of suffering in the work of the Messiah. Perhaps it's also easier to understand our own ignorance about what is involved in bearing the image of a suffering servant and why it is necessary to consider that there are truths about bearing Jesus' image we will only discover through suffering. So if suffering is expected and necessary in our development as human beings, how do you deal with the trauma that is created by that suffering? Is there a way to maximize the awakening benefits of suffering and minimize or decrease the negative effects of, PTSD that it's going to create, the damage to the nervous system, effects on the brain and chemicals and neural pathways, or self-regulating behaviors of addiction that can create? Is there a pathway that helps you have the awakening, because suffering is just going to happen, with decreasing the trauma and the damage it will cause you to your physical body?
Wow, that's a great question. I think the suffering, at least the way that it's framed in the Old Testament, in categorizing certain psalms, for instance, as psalms of orientation, the early stage religion, beginning faith.
Everything is exactly as I expect it to be.
Yeah.
Everything's oriented.
Yeah.
And then there's what was the third?
Well, and then the second category are psalms of disorientation, when there's chaos, and the psalmist is describing the Babylonians chopping the temple apart and killing. It's graphic and it's brutal. And then the third category, psalms of new orientation. And so then just in the Psalter, the emotional center of faith of the nation of Israel, there's this picture of relinquishing, suffering, the death, literally, but as a metaphor and symbol in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And in one way, there's no remedy. So all of the damage of trauma, it's awful, it's horrendous, and it's shocking, jarring. And in my work, my previous position with combat veterans, there's no way to erase that from their memory. And so they have to find a way forward. And the implication is that can only happen in the life of faith anyway. It can only happen by the power of God. So the return of the remnant only happens by the power of God. God turning the heart of the Persian king and authorizing Nehemiah, actually giving him money. Say, oh, yeah, God told me to do this. Go build the city. It's a profound miracle. And then the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament. And so that same drama, I think, happens in our lives. It happened in mine. It takes time. And I'm remarried and happily married. Next year will be 30 years.
Congratulations.
So thank you. That's my new orientation. And in a lot of other ways, the new orientation manifests in my own life. And then in the life of faith, I think the suffering piece is the kenosis. So in Philippians 2, talking about the emptying, the self-emptying, that is one of the most vivid pictures in the life of faith, is these moments of profound disorientation and sorrow, where we relinquish life itself at times. For me, it was my wife. For others, it's maybe a child, a marriage, a house burns down. For my dad, it was his calling to ministry. And then to talk about what happens in the new orientation, what's interesting in trauma studies is a paradigm, I call it a paradigm, the paradigm of post-traumatic growth.
And I've not heard that term.
Okay.
That's really interesting.
I think in trauma studies, there's kind of a heightened focus and awareness of the 20 symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, currently in the DSM. 20 symptoms, flashbacks, and they can all be categorized in avoidance strategies, re-experiencing, those kind of things. That's to focus on trauma and the suffering of these shatterings. But in post-traumatic growth, something typically happens that's transformative in the life of the sufferer. Sometimes all it takes is one person in a committed relationship to say, no matter what, no matter how bad your life is, I will always be here for you. And that in and of itself is a transformative experience. They can continue to choose life and find a way out, find a new orientation, post-traumatic growth. And so Tedeschi and Calhoun, in their studies of post-traumatic growth, they identify these 5 domains that can guide therapy, guide programs, personal relationships, seeing opportunities, recognizing personal strengths in yourself. Those are 3 big ones. And then spiritual change and value of life, value of human life. Those 5 domains. And I would say in the writings, too, of a guy named Paul Wong, Dr. Paul Wong, who says suffering is really essential for attaining maturity and wisdom. And I think that's part of the message of the Old Testament. Suffering seemed to be essential in all the leaders, the life of Moses, the life of Joseph, Job, you name it. There's a long list. Hebrews 11 is
That's a very long list.
Very long list. Yeah. So the suggestion seems to be suffering is essential, but that's not a good enrollment strategy. It's a hard sell to try to gain converts. So it's much easier to say, I'm in, right out, right up, right down, right, happy all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that the life of faith is rosy, and to what Kate Bowler calls the tyranny of prescribed joy. There's this prescription of joy.
The tyranny of prescribed joy.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And I would expand that, the tyranny of prescribed hope. I would say I'm a hopeful person, but I wouldn't say that I'm an optimist.
Mm-hmm.
As a therapist, I see
you've seen a lot.
It's a different life, different side of the congregation that I saw at age 16, different medical mistakes in my wife's care. But through it all, I agree with Walter Brueggemann that the overarching narrative in the human story is into the pit and then out of the pit by the power of Yahweh, and only by the power of Yahweh many times.
You said that suffering is essential, and I would say that it's inevitable.
Yes, certainly that.
Nobody gets out of it. And you quoted Richard Rohr, which he's one of my favorite people. You said all great spirituality is about what we do with our pain. It seems as though pain is going to be just inevitable. I mean, even the Zen Buddhists, the Buddhist first pillar is life is suffering. So you argue that suffering is the central way to imagine or to image the incarnate Christ, and then you give kind of 5 boxes to house the theology of suffering. And you wrote a whole chapter on it. You said there's the Christian life that is against suffering, the Christian life that equals suffering, the Christian life transforming suffering, the Christian life as above suffering, and the Christian life as suffering in paradox. Can you kind of give us a little synopsis of those boxes and what they mean? And is there like a right answer about which one of these is the right way to view suffering, or is it more of a posture that you have at any given stage of life and faith?
Okay, I'll just tip my hand a little bit, and
that was a big question.
It was, but it's a good synopsis of the chapter, and I'm delighted that you read that far, because it's not one of the early chapters.
It's not. No, it's in there.
Yeah, I think in terms of developmentally, the development of faith, but then also the development of the human person, I would say that faith against suffering makes a lot of sense to early stage faith, beginning faith.
The prescribed joy.
Prescribed joy. Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. So, there's almost like this idolatry of Galatians 5, the Spirit-filled, the ideal of the Christian life is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, goodness, gentleness, faith, temperance.
We turn those into emotions, which instead of virtues, which is different.
Yeah. So therefore, we have this tyranny of prescribed joy, or tyranny of prescribed hope, or even tyranny of prescribed faith. If you only had faith, well, your wife would have been healed, or my dad wouldn't have lost the confidence vote, things like that. So that makes sense, I think, in people's the early stages of faith.
Do you think it's natural to be in that stage in an early?
I think so, because when parents who want to teach their children that this is a moral situation that you're in, and if you obey, you'll get rewarded. If you disobey, something else is going to happen.
We actually talked about stages of faith in my last weekend when I interviewed Jackie Turner. She did the classic stages of faith, 6 stages with the wall.
Oh yeah,
and,
Fowler.
So I didn't really realize that you're kind of singing harmony to this.
Well, I don't come right out and say it in the dissertation, because I really want to honor the people who seem to maintain these positions even in their adult life and later adult life. So I would say the faith against suffering, and by the way, it does make sense according to some passages. Like Jesus appears to be against suffering. He heals the sick, and so isn't that in a way part of his making disciples? So we should be all about that, alleviating suffering. And I'm all for that. I mean, I'm a therapist, and I believe in alleviating distress. But, there's more to it.
Yeah.
It's not that simple.
So then you go into Christian life equals suffering. What's that one look like?
Well, that one is, I would say, developmentally, that might be around the third one.
So you're a Christian, you should expect
that
the world is going to hate you, and so now we can have like a martyr complex, a persecution complex.
Yeah, this is happening to me because, I told that person the truth.
Right, right.
So being a Christian, there's some expectation of suffering. Jesus says, if they did this to me, they're going to do this to you. The one that it's in between, I would say, just loosely suggest it's faith above suffering. Well, maybe suffering happens, but we're supposed to rise above it. And Paul will say things like, I consider the, temporary suffering of this world not to be compared with
the eternal glory that's to come.
Yeah, Romans 8.
Yeah, that's right out of Romans 8.
Yeah, right out of Romans 8. So there's this greater than, lesser than comparison, and we should always focus on the greater than.
That's just more spiritual bypassing than it is actual transcendence.
Yeah.
Where we're using cliches to try and explain away the reality of the situation. And I think that would be an unhealthy form of trying to transcend suffering, but just grabbing for whatever verses that cliche the moment away without actually indwelling the moment as it is. And that's, when I've done about 20 funerals this year so far, because I guess I'm good at them. But
you must be.
I always, when I welcome people, we open in prayer, and I always say, let's just pause and acknowledge the reality of this moment.
Nice, yes.
And I let people feel exactly the weight of this moment, because then we can move forward and process through starting the grief journey off right. But I always take that first moment, and I think, that earlier Christian stage stuff, we just want to cliche reality away and then call it transcendence. But we're not transcending it. Is there a form where the Christian life transforms suffering or is above suffering, transcends it, that is a little more healthier than just spiritual bypassing it away with cliched verses?
Yeah. Well, I think just to get back to the Apostle Paul and what he, in my opinion, when I read that passage, I don't hear a dismissal, like minimizing, which is more strategy of denial or avoidance.
But he doesn't deny in chapter 7. That's a pretty
that's
a pretty hefty one.
And you have to go there in order to get to chapter 8.
Right. And you've got to travel through 6 or 7 first.
Yeah. In the math that I learned,
yes,
those early numbers come first. And so even in his life, the stonings and the beatings, and that he despaired even of life. I mean, I have a hard time imagining Paul saying, oh, it's nothing. It's just a flesh wound. I'm thinking now of
Monty
heaven.
Python. You quoted Monty Python.
Yeah.
That was good.
John Cleese and the Apostle Paul mashup.
Yeah.
So even the embodiment of those verses of the Apostle Paul, that can't be a good interpretation of what he means. Just reading his biography, a biography of adversity. And again, in Romans 8, when you hear people trot out, all things work together for the good, we'll understand it better by and by. It's like, well, yeah, but if you back up a few verses, it's like all of creation is groaning. And just because I'm a Christian, I don't escape, because we who have the first fruits groan inwardly as we wait. It's like, yeah, there's this promise, the eschaton, when death will be no more. And it's swallowed up in victory, like Paul says. That's a future event in my eschatology. And we're not there yet. But while we wait, not only does creation groan, and we groan who have the first fruits, but God, the third person of the Trinity, is groaning.
Spirit within.
Yeah. So we've got a groaning Father, we've got a groaning Son, and we've got a groaning Holy Spirit. So it's hard for me to listen to arguments for impassibility, that God doesn't suffer. It's like, really? Right. How do you read this part here where the Holy Spirit is groaning? What is that? Anyway, the idea of transcending, it's not just mind over matter, pretend it's not happening. That's dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus is not dissociating when he's on the cross, and I don't think he expects us to. It's to face it, to, like Job, be able to stand in faith, and even if I die, I'm going to trust. It's that kind of faith. You can't say that you have it until you've suffered.
And that you've mentioned just in our conversations before, I don't think I saw the direct text in your dissertation, but an uninitiated faith.
Yeah.
And so much of like the modern Western church is insulated from suffering and pain because of, our privilege and our riches and our healthcare and we can insulate so much for so long. And it's almost as if we're like stuck in these phases because we're insulated from the reality of suffering. And then when that insulation wears out, where, we experience, a chronic illness or death of a loved one, or just, caretaking somebody with disability or poverty or oppression, when the insulation wears out, then it seems like our faith like breaks, and all of a sudden we don't understand God in this realm, in this place. Do you think that has something to do with like the transforming of suffering, or living in the paradox of suffering, those last two categories?
I do. And faith transforming suffering can also be suffering transforming faith.
Oh.
So the uninitiated faith maybe is a yet to be transformed faith. It's a valuable faith. It's a necessary faith, and we ought to be careful with that kind of faith, the uninitiated faith. But it's in that crucible where it seems most often people jettison faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so to hold on to that kind of faith is to be able to recognize the crying out and the questions as faith. What I was also thinking about in faith and suffering and paradox is more the laissez-faire, there's a time for war, there's a time for peace, there's a time for suffering, there's a time for joy.
And I should maintain an emotional stability through it all.
Yeah. Peace, love, and rock out,
Yeah.
That lifestyle, which I'm not bashing it, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying there's some wisdom. It comes right out of the text of the wisdom literature in the Bible. There's a time for all these things. And so holding them kind of at a distance philosophically, intellectually, that's what I meant by faith and suffering and paradox.
Mm-hmm.
But for Camus, there's no emotional distancing. There's no intellectual distancing. There's no philosophizing in theodicy. It's raw. It's in your face and hard for people to read, but I don't see that as atheistic. I see it as an expression of faith, this part of this mess, the chaotic struggle to adapt of the trauma victim, and then transformation from outside of us. For me, transformation from outside of me came in a moment of kind of illumination and realizing that my question, why did my wife die? I probably wouldn't get a good answer there. But what I did get is an invitation to begin to study spiritual formation. That maybe what God was after in my life wasn't to teach me something in the classic educational sense, which seems really narcissistic. And well, if it was about me, couldn't he have, had me read it in a book? Why did it have to cost my wife her life? So the transformation was this idea of forming the man of sorrows within me, to feel deep in my splanchna, the Greek word for bowels, to feel in my bowels what Christ as a man of sorrows felt. That approach to suffering, of spiritual formation, that's more of a doorway that I want to invite people to, because it seems more congruent with life as it really is, in the valley, in the trenches, in the hospital rooms.
Yeah. I think doing all these funerals, what it's taught me is that Christians really like labels.
Yeah.
We like to slap labels on things so that we feel safe interacting with it. People say, well, I tell them that I practice meditation. Was it Christian meditation? Slap the Christian label on it. It's like, I don't know. It's there.
Yeah.
It's meditation. It's like, is that Christian cereal you had for breakfast this morning? It's like,
yeah.
Christian, we use it as an adjective when it's supposed to be a noun. And since we are so obsessed with the labels on things, people get really anxious about whether or not they still have the label on them. And they enter suffering, or they enter deconstruction or dark night, and they think to themselves, I've lost the faith. I'm no longer a part of the faith. You mentioned with Camus saying, just naming reality as it is and how he's encountering it can be a form of faith. It's just, it might not have the slapped Christian t-shirt on it that says this is Christian, tried and true and approved.
Yeah.
And I've been noticing, instead of wondering, is it got the approved labels on it, I look at the essence of something.
Yeah.
The contents of the container, not just whatever label is on the outside. As you said, your experience as a 16-year-old and you getting into the contents of people's souls in this. They had the Christian label, but then their souls came out in this meeting and they were tenaciously after your dad. And you're like, but this had the label on it that says it was pre-approved and safe and okay. And then we look at other people and they say, oh, I gave up the faith because I went through this questioning or dark night or deconstruction or intense suffering and I couldn't make sense of it anymore. But what I've noticed is that people take the label off, but the essence is still the same. They may not have the words to describe it or even the paradigm to try and jam it inside of, but they're the same person. They're just more honest about where they're at. And they're not comfortable with the labeling system that we invented to make us feel safe.
Yeah.
And when you allow people to be themselves and to be honest, you give them permission to put down that imposter syndrome and everybody suffers. Everybody's having a hard time. Everybody's questioning whether or not they're good enough in this world. And when you can just give people that permission, I've found that you get in contact with the essence of the person instead of just trying to slap a label on them or the event or whatever. And when you get down to the essence, you can have real, honest, and raw conversations that help people feel like they belong still, even though they're uncomfortable claiming a theology or a doctrine or a stance or a social stance on something that's hot topic, or even just a label of I'm this religion or that religion. And there's this increase in the nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, where they're just like, I'm done with the label. But I'm noticing that the contents haven't changed much. They're just honest about, I'm not sure if I can slap the label on me anymore. Do you think that suffering brings us into the brings us into contact with the essence of life as it is, so that we can just kind of be authentic with ourselves and our questions and be honest? Is that the transforming power of suffering? Not necessarily that it's suffering, but that it brings you to a place of reality again?
I think so. And I think it's, I like how you're labeling some of these talks you're having as deconstructing, which I think that's what Jesus' strategy was, one of them, in his life. The parables, for instance. John Dominic Crossan writes about parable deconstructing myth. And I think every generation has these social myths, and religious communities particularly have these myths. And I mean that in a sense of how to organize truth and reality. I don't mean that it isn't true. It's just what we make up about it to organize it. Mm-hmm. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan is deconstructing this purity myth, the Levitical purity myth, or in other ways, the Deuteronomic myth of that if you study Torah, life will work. What's the book of Job about if it's not that? It's the counter testimony to the testimony of Deuteronomy 28 particularly. And so I think it's when you get outside of these myths, the prophets, most of them were outliers, and they were put there, cast out, or they placed themselves there. And one of my favorites is Ezekiel. I'm not sure that he wanted to be an outlier, but the Babylonians kind of made that decision for him and took him captive. And here he is, he's about at the age where he would begin his life as a priest, an active priest in Jerusalem and in the temple. But no, that's not going to be his life. He's in exile. But you know how the book of Ezekiel starts out? God shows up.
I remember that you talk a lot about Ezekiel. He's one of your favorites.
Yeah. So here's this guy probably wondering, how's my life going to work now? The temple is destroyed. Maybe his family died. He was the son of a priest, obviously. And the initiation of his life as a prophet is the glory of God appears to him in Babylon, of all places. And so I think people are afraid of wandering around outside or on the periphery of these labels, as you call them, trying to stay in the center of this circle, the bullseye. Mm-hmm. And it's precisely on the periphery, on the outside, and even in exile, that the glory of God shows up and inaugurates this beautiful ministry of Ezekiel, where he's given all these beautiful visions of a future for the nation of Israel. And so the trauma that happens in the nation of Israel, post-traumatic growth, the vision of it is through Ezekiel. The temple that waters the whole earth, and the two sticks that are joined in the north and the south are going to be joined and reunited. All that's visionary. You have to imagine it, because it's Jerusalem and the temple are all in ruins. And so even in the midst of what appears to be the ruin of my life and for a lot of other people, God can show up on the periphery. And only when God shows up, I think, can there be the kind of transformation that I'm talking about in that fifth posture, which is faith transformed by suffering. Or it says the same thing the other way, suffering transformed by faith.
I like that. It's flip-flopped and still true.
Yeah.
Richard Rohr says that the only thing powerful enough to wake us up is great love or great suffering. And I think those are the things, like we have all these mythologies that we believe about ourselves and our God, and they're just given to us by culture and society and church, and we just assume that they're true, and then they're tested by this suffering, brings us into the reality of how life actually is. And then we have to figure out, how is my faith more than a set of propositions? Yeah. And how can I how can I have a set of not just faith as in propositions and understandings, but as a mode of trust in this understanding that God is life and God is love, and I am going to trust. I hate to use that phrase because I'm not spiritually bypassing, but I trust that love is the better way.
Yeah.
Every time love is better than power. Love is better than evil. Love is better than oppression. And I notice this in the gospel messages, is that Christ is showing that love is the better way every time. And the disciples just don't want to believe it because they want to crown him as king and be the global superpower and put everyone in submission to them. And Christ says, no, this is for the whole world. It's not for you guys. You're included, but it's not just for you. Yeah. And that's not always an emotion that we can just feel. Yeah. But we use the prayer in my church, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, as an expression of hope, because all things are not well, and all things are not well, and all manner of things are not well currently. But there is this trust that love is the better way and works this out. And somehow. And
well, that prayer comes from Julian of Norwich, as I'm sure you know. And what I find profound about her story is that she actually prayed and asked God for an experience of intense suffering, and prayed for a long time. And according to her writing anyway, God granted that request, and she describes a dying experience. So when she says all will be well, she's reflecting on this power of God that kept her in love through this profound suffering experience she calls dying. And then she lives, and she lives to commit herself to serving other people as an anchoress, and then can say, all will be well. It doesn't mean everything is well with my soul. It just means all will be well. There is a promise, and there is a rock solid place to stand when we go through suffering, and that's the love of God. Well,
it permeates everything.
Yeah.
I think that is a good spot to kind of close this.
I think so.
Out. But
Thank you.
I appreciate our conversations. You're a wise man, and I appreciate that our friendship that's lasted 10 years. And I hope to interview you again.
Oh, I'd be more than happy.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.
I don't know how to stop these, so I just hit stop and then it stops.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Liminal Living. Still walking to the post office and processing. But if this was helpful for you, share it with a friend. Wherever you are on your deconstruction journey, whether you've fully deconstructed, disidentified as a Christian, you're still in there, but trying to figure out how to fit and how to belong, you belong. And you belong here. I'm grateful for you and for you listening. So we'll see you next week.